Hello there. I'm so delighted you've joined me tonight for a very exciting story, part 4 of our story, and it's getting incredibly juicy. What we've had in our story is that both Blakely and her sister Nina have arrived at the cabin very close to Yellowstone National Park. And what could possibly go wrong? I can't imagine, can you? So before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up. And let's get started with the final part of our story tonight. Thank God for modern technology. That's what I say, said Nina appreciatively, as the GPS told us at the next turning we would have reached our final destination. Ostensibly without the GPS, I am quite certain we'd have been driving around in circles, trying desperately to find this place, for even the owner had warned my sister that finding the cabin was tantamount to looking for a needle in a haystack, and by the looks of things she wasn't exaggerating on that. The area we found ourselves circumnavigating was spectacular in every imaginable sense of the word. There was nothing shy or reticently understated about the scenery, that easily flaunted its majestic beauty with an assertive, bold confidence that it would even have outshone Laura Ferguson. The anger I felt about not going to Brazil had somewhat dissipated, as my appreciative eyes gladly drank in all the prepossessing scenery, with an unbridled enthusiasm. This was heightened still further, when a herd of bison just trotted across the road ahead of us, stopping short in their tracks to view us with a cursory glance. They seemed unintimidated by our presence, and almost appeared tame. Let's not kid, they were magnificent to behold, so I quickly took some photographs of them. Nina stopped her car abruptly, as we happily watched the herd sauntering down the road at an easy-going pace, as if they had all the time in the world on their hands. It felt rather as if we were on a wildlife safari, in a manner of speaking, and we weren't exactly even in Africa. Put it this way, if a lion had walked out onto the middle of the road, it wouldn't have looked out of place. I suddenly began to feel rather excited about staying in a quaint cabin in the middle of nowhere. It all seemed so wistfully romantic. Nina got a phone call from my mother, and she put it on loudspeaker so I could listen in. I remember feeling grievously annoyed by my mother's obvious intrusiveness, which we could well do without. What on earth did she want, I thought? I was beginning to enjoy myself, and she had to butt in as usual, ruin our fun, rather like a dog disturbing a cat's meal by taking it over and gobbling down all the pellets. "Hi, Mum," said Nina teasingly. "Are you already missing us? We only saw you about 6 hours ago, I may remind you." "Have you found the cabin yet, love?" my mother inquired. "I was just wondering, because you know I have been warned it's very difficult to find." "Don't worry, Mum. We're here. We haven't got to the cabin yet, but we're almost there, around the next corner, I believe it is. We've just seen a herd of bison. They were so wonderful to watch." "Oh, how lovely. I'm so delighted, dear," said my mother. "I'm sure you're going to thoroughly enjoy your trip. You don't have room for a third party, do you, to join you by any chance?" "You mean you want to join us?" asked Nina, expressing surprise. And in my mind I was screaming out, "Please, God, no." The last thing I wanted in the entire world was for my mother to join us and to spoil our fun. "Oh, I'm not talking about myself, dear. Good Lord, no. Can you imagine how Blakely would feel if I intruded on your week's holiday? Let me tell you, she wouldn't be remotely happy about that, and I wouldn't blame her either. I certainly am not going to spoil your fun. It's poor Eloise Ferguson I'm talking about, Nina dear. Sadly, she's got entangled in a bit of a mess. Her father sent her a plane ticket to return from Brazil and get back to Idaho. He picked Eloise up from the airport a short while ago. She was desperately upset and in quite the state. He thinks it would do her good to join you on the holiday. Unfortunately, things in Brazil went very pear-shaped, I believe. He says he can organise a car for the 6-hour trip so that Eloise could be at the cabin in the morning. I said yes at once. It seemed like the right thing to do. Besides, I really do believe that Blakely would love to spend time with her best friend. Which means that you, Nina, well, you can get to relax at the cabin while Blakely and Eloise explore the countryside together. Maybe you can get down to some of your reading. I just wondered, are you on board with this idea, Nina? I can easily nip it in the bud if you like. But Eloise would love to spend time with Blakely at the cabin, if it's all right with you. I didn't have the heart to refuse her." I was nodding excitedly, hardly believing that Eloise would be joining me at the cabin. It seemed too good to be true. "That's fine, Mum. We'd love to have Eloise join us." Blakely is nodding excitedly, because I think she'd be very ecstatic to have her best friend here. I also might get some reading done. It's a win-win situation all round as far as I'm concerned. Good then. Well, I will confirm with Barry Ferguson that he can organise a car to send Eloise here. I'll give him the details of the whereabouts of the cabin. "Ma'am, what is all this about?" asked Nina. "I thought that Eloise was going on an all-expenses-paid trip to Brazil with her mother. Why would she leave that behind to return to Idaho? It makes no sense at all." "Honestly, it's too awful, love, the whole story. Would you believe it, when Eloise and her mother got to Brazil, shortly after they booked into a lavish hotel, they went to the beach together. I gather a man approached them and started chatting up Laura Ferguson. He was very tanned and was wearing a skimpy yellow Speedo. He charmed Laura Ferguson, let me tell you, and I'm told Laura sauntered off with the Brazilian man. She left Eloise to her own devices on the beach. She did call Eloise and tell her she was spending time with this man, and that Eloise should carry on staying at the hotel and doing her own thing. Well, Eloise felt very vulnerable on her own, as you can imagine, especially when one creep came up to her on the beach and started pestering her. She felt dreadfully alone in her hotel suite, so she phoned her father, who was mortified that his ex-wife abandoned her own daughter to saunter off with some Brazilian man. In truth, Laura Ferguson didn't even appear to consider her own daughter's needs. Barry Ferguson assured me that this was so typical of Laura's behaviour when he was married to her. She's always been so dreadfully selfish, I believe, only considering her needs above everybody else's. He said that that was one of the pivotal reasons he chose to divorce her." "Good Lord, Mum, I can't believe she did that. It's disgusting. Who abandons their own daughter and saunters off with some Brazilian man? It's a despicable thing to do. The woman should be ashamed of herself." "Well, she's not responsible, is she? She should have taken charge over Eloise. But she bogs off with this man, wearing a bright yellow swimming costume that left nothing to the imagination, I believe. It seems Laura Ferguson has found the perfect match for herself, as this man appears to have very little modesty. They are like two peas in a pod, you could say. I gather Blakely said they were all over each other, like a rash. She didn't know where to look, she was so embarrassed. That poor girl. I spoke to Mr. Ferguson at great length. He's a very nice man, you know. He thinks it's horrifying what Laura has done, but he says it gives him grounds to get custody of Eloise, and Eloise has told him she'd like to live with him permanently. When she told him about the men Laura has been entertaining at the house very regularly, and some are sleazy types, I believe, that rocked up at the house to spend time with Laura Ferguson, he was mortified to learn of this. And rightly so. Anyway, when Laura got off the plane, she was visibly upset and shaken for having been left all on her own. She was left at the hotel ordering room service. It's shameful, that's what it is. Eloise told her father how she wished she could be on holiday with Blakely. That's why he phoned me after he heard about Blakely staying in a cabin near the Yellowstone National Park, and asked if we wouldn't mind if his daughter joined us. So that's where the story is. It's rather good news, I think, for Blakely, don't you think?" "It's fabulous news, isn't it, Blakely?" said Nina, turning around to look at me with a sparkle in her eyes. "Eloise will be joining us in the morning. Do you want to say thanks to Mum, Blakely?" "Thanks, Mum," I said rather sheepishly, wishing that I didn't have to speak to her at all. But she couldn't be all that bad, given she was allowing Eloise to join me at the cabin in the morning. "No problem at all, love. All in a day's work, you can say. I think the beach holiday in Brazil would have been pretty lonely for the both of you, judging by what Mrs. Ferguson did, abandoning your best friend like that. Honestly, that woman is the end. But then again, All is well that ends well. My heart lifted to hear the good news that Eloise would be joining us in the morning. Was I surprised that Laura Ferguson had abandoned Eloise on a beach in Brazil, as she sauntered off with a man wearing a tight yellow bathing suit? I can't say I was. Nothing surprised me about the woman. I could see the scenario so vividly in my mind. I guess I'd always known that the gospel of Laura Ferguson's life was me, myself, and I. I couldn't believe how well things had turned out, as having Eloise at the cabin would be an absolute blast, and it meant my sister Nina could get stuck into one of her books, while me and Eloise went off on an intrepid adventure of our own. As by nature we were both athletic and loved the countryside, we enjoyed walking, running and exploring. I think if the truth be told, Nina was secretly happy she wouldn't have to be entertaining me all the time, which meant she had some time to herself. If things worked out for Eloise favourably, which I seriously hoped they would, maybe her father would get legal custody over her, and then her life would be so much better. She could grow up in a loving family environment where she wouldn't have to put up with her mother's unbridled ways that left much to be desired. "Don't you think the scenery around here is spectacular, Blakely?" Nina asked me. "As far as I'm concerned, this place is gorgeous, and it's not too far away from our home in Idaho either. You'll find this area is revered for its hot springs, mountains, lakes and forests, all that have been shaped by the volcanic activity that happened here over millions of years ago, so some of the views can be quite dramatic, and given the cabin is so off the beaten track, I'm sure we'll be privy to seeing an abundance of wildlife here, and you're going to like that, Blakely." "Of course I am," I said. "It really is magnificent." "Well, your mother encouraged me to take you away somewhere like this. She knows how you appreciate wildlife. And you're going to get it all out here. But this place does feel somewhat remote, don't you think? But perhaps that makes it all the more special. 3 of us are going to be together, caught up in this great big cocoon, and no one else is going to be around to invade our privacy. And I think that's wonderful, don't you?" The woman's voice on the GPS repeated herself. 100 meters to your right, and you have reached your destination." Nina and I both cheered very happily. I was glad the trip had come to an end. I couldn't imagine facing more than 6 hours in an SUV on the road. I wasn't the most patient traveller at the best of times, and 6 hours, as far as I was concerned, was long enough. I had thoroughly enjoyed Nina's cheerful companionship during the journey. We had listened to some of our favourite tracks together, all with a beaty rhythm, and we'd sung along with various artists to our heart's content, even though our singing was somewhat tuneless. Nina drove her stout green SUV rather gingerly down the long windy path through the trees. The path eventually opened out into a large grassy verge, liberally decorated with evergreen trees. In the background, the whole viridescent landscape boasted a selection of mountainous valleys that folded into each other seamlessly in a prepossessing pattern of voluptuous curves, as if stretching themselves out, rather like bodies on a beach, under a magnificent azure blue sky. One part of the valley descended into a deep incline, which I imagine would have been a treacherous walk to undertake, for it was incredibly rocky, and would probably have only inspired the athletically inclined. A burgeoning mist covered the mountains in a misty white vapour, which gave the valleys a mysterious appearance that was intriguing. I could hear all the bird calls from miles around, and observed a fish-eagle, with its majestic wings outstretched, soaring the heavenlies with such an extraordinary nimble grace. I knew the fish-eagle's discernible appearance meant that water was not far from here, and I recalled my mother mentioning a creek in the woods, which I was later to discover was more like a meandering stream. My attention was so completely consumed by the glorious views that swaddled me on every side, that for a brief moment I ignored the cabin, for it seemed so tiny and insignificant set against such an all-expansive wilderness that went on for ever and ever. The great size of the burgeoning groves of trees and the sizable mountainous valleys made me and Nina feel that in the grand scheme of things we were probably no more than ants. My sister had told me the cabin was an old miner's cabin, so it wasn't exactly a fairy tale to look upon, but I didn't care, and that didn't bother me in the slightest. I hadn't come to the cabin to enjoy the glamorous life. I was here to rough it, and the cabin would suit us perfectly well. Yes, it was somewhat mediocre and rather humdrum, but to be fair, it blended in with the natural environment superbly and didn't seem at all out of place. Some added features had exponentially improved the cabin, like a generous-sized wraparound porch that hugged the exterior. I'm glad to say that the owner of the cabin had taken the initiative to make the interior cosy, even though it was so incredibly small that there was barely enough room to swing a cat. I was happy that me and Eloise would get to share a bedroom together, and there was a bunk bed in our room, so I decided I'd be sleeping on the top bunk, and that would be non-negotiable. The following morning Eloise arrived at the cabin right on time, and that was when the fun really started. But little did I know that the fun would lead to a nightmare that we'd never see coming. A nightmare which would ultimately throw our reality onto a pair of roller skates, for I would quickly learn that this world is a lot more mysterious than I ever credited it to be. It was at 3 o'clock in the afternoon that me and Eloise told my sister Nina that we were going to take a casual stroll in the woods. Nina was unconcerned about our eagerness to go exploring and told us to stick together and not to be away for very long, no longer than a couple of hours. Nina was not exactly an outdoorsy type, so Eloise's presence on this holiday meant she didn't have to accompany me on any intrepid treks through the woods. Instead, she could settle down happily and read a book, which is exactly what she did. And even before we left the cabin, we saw that Nina was snuggled up on a sofa in the lounge, with a glass of wine in her hands, her nose happily tucked into a thriller that I knew she'd be unlikely to be able to put down. She got through thrillers more than some men get through pints at a bar in a night. It was such a magnificently beautiful afternoon, as me and Eloise sauntered through the labyrinth of tall, lofty trees that seemed to welcome us gladly as we entered the grove. We chatted happily together about how good it was to finally be together again. Eloise told me how lonely and frightened she had been in Brazil on the beach, left to her own devices when her mother abandoned her, especially when she was later accosted by some weirdo, which meant she refused to go back to the beach again and had hidden herself away in her hotel suite, ordering room service all day long and growing increasingly bored. "Why is your mother like that?" I asked Eloise. "Why did she just bog off with a complete stranger? She's not a good mother. She has no sense of responsibility, does she?" Eloise shrugged her shoulders nonchalantly. "My dad's horrified by what my mum's done. He's absolutely shocked. He reckons the court will favour him, and he'll get full custody of me, so that I can finally move in with him." "And you want to move in with him?" I asked her. "I do," Eloise said. "I will still attend the same school with you, so we'll still be best friends. My dad doesn't live far away from you, so it's all cool. I guess my mother is the way she is because she's so insecure. She looks for validation wherever she can find it, and I think she finds it in men's arms. You should see the way she was with that Brazilian man. They were all over each other. It was disgusting to watch. I wanted to tell her to go and get a room, but I guess she did that anyway. Your mother should be ashamed of herself," I said in disgust. "She abandoned you for a complete stranger on the beach. I mean, who does that?" "I guess she's never going to change," Eloise admitted. "She is who she is. I do love her, of course, but you're right. She's an irresponsible mother, and I don't always feel completely safe at home. Not with all the men she invites around. What if one of them was, to become really wacko, like the weirdo on the beach?" "I hadn't thought of it like that," I admitted. As we walked through the subterranean oasis, down the undulating footpaths through the trees that were liberally scattered with pine needles, we could hear the pretty trills of the birdsong in the canopy above our heads, accompanied by the babbling sound of fast-moving water. That was when we discovered the source of the water. It was a long-flowing stream that tumbled through the woods gallantly, rolling over stones and sweeping past us at a furiously fast stride. I suddenly realized that was why I'd seen a fish-eagle when I first arrived here, majestically soaring the skies. The sparkling stream was surrounded by tall, gnarled-looking trees that lackadaisically dragged their leafy boughs into the edge of the water, which I noticed was richly abundant with all kinds of fish. It was so serene and peaceful in the woods, but at one point Eloise and I heard strange chanting sounds, which really was hauntingly eerie and pretty spooky. It freaked us out, for we knew the woods belonged to the owner of the cabin, and were private property. So who was making that strange noise? Whoever they were likely trespassing on private land and had no business in being here. In theory, no one should be out here at all, apart from me, Eloise, and my sister Nina. We could hear the dramatic, rhythmic beat of drums intermingled with the flute and the jangling sound of instruments I'm not well acquainted with. It sounded like Native American music to me, rather like a worship chant that the ancient indigenous people used to embrace when worshipping the Great Spirit. I knew enough about Native American music to be acquainted with the verbal pulsations, powerful drumming, ethereal flute melodies, and 5-note scales. But out here in the woods it was incongruously out of place, and there was something so intriguing about the music that sparked our attention and teased our interest, nudging us to move ever forwards down the long twisted pathways through the trees, where stones precariously jutted out of the soil, and ferns and ivies grew together in a tangled chaos of foliage. By all accounts, me and Eloise were completely nonplussed to encounter this strange anomaly in the woods that made no sense to us at all. We privately wondered what it could all mean, and exchanged confounded glances with each other, our faces registering a great deal of bewilderment. Ostensibly, the Indian chanting was the last thing we'd expected to encounter on a casual stroll in the woods. The sound was disturbingly disquieting and very haunting. The notes of the music were middle range, and the chanting seemed to be quite nasal, I thought. A cold chill travelled down my spine, along with a feeling of impending dread that completely overcame me. I began to shiver almost uncontrollably, and my stomach muscles clenched so tightly that it actually pained me to breathe. Something felt terribly wrong. Even Eloise looked as if she'd been quite spooked by the discordant sound of the music. She looked at me nervously and said what I'd been thinking all along, but been too afraid to express. "Something doesn't feel right. That sound is creeping me the hell out." "Me too," I whispered, caught up in a mixture of curious interest that had been piqued and a desperate need to run to the safety of the cabin. I looked at Eloise and said, "Do you think we should go back to the cabin? I think it might be a good idea. I don't know about you, Eloise, but I'm spooked by this music. I think these woods may be haunted. I really do." Eloise shook her head. "Don't be silly. We've only just started exploring these woods. I don't want to go back. Think about it, Blakely. If we go back to the cabin, we'll be driving ourselves completely insane, wondering where this chanting sound comes from. I want to find out what's going on, don't you? And as for being haunted, what does that actually mean? Are you suggesting there are ghosts in the woods playing that music? I don't think so, Blakely." "But why not? It's a possibility," I insisted. "I mean, no one should be on this land, should they? You're overreacting, Blakely. For all we know, someone is in the woods playing Native American music on a radio." "The music doesn't sound like it's on a radio," I told my friend. "It sounds live to me." But the idea of a radio playing out all this music in the woods did seem to soothe my anxiety. Eloise was a lot more assertively bold than I was, and a big part of my burgeoning reluctance was swiped away by her resolute determination to get to the bottom of this enigmatic mystery. Eloise wanted to investigate what the music was, and where it was coming from. If we returned to the cabin, with these questions rolling around in our heads, like the stones in the stream being shifted forward by the water, we'd be forever cursing ourselves for being far too timid to find out what the sound was all about, and more to the point, where it was coming from. It would seem a little voice in my head was warning me to turn around and go straight back to the cabin. But then I persuaded myself I was being a wuss. I didn't want to look pathetically feeble in front of my best friend. I did have some pride after all. Besides, what harm would it do to investigate the source of the chanting that seemed to be drawing us curiously deeper and deeper into the woods, almost as if we were being pulled towards its trajectory by an invisible thread? Eloise appeared to be more curious than afraid on this little soiree of ours, while I was like a lapdog following her every lead, and terribly afraid to stick up for myself. But the uneasiness I was feeling refused to abate, and appeared to be getting worse. I know if Nina had been on this stroll in the woods with us, she'd have told us to get the hell out of there, for something was very wrong, and Nina was governed by her gut instincts and always listened to them. I was suddenly hit with the profound sense that something didn't want us here in the woods, and we weren't welcome among this labyrinth of trees. I told myself the idea was completely ridiculous. My mother had paid very good money for us to stay at the cabin, so we weren't trespassing on private property, and we had every right to be here. I was going to make the most of this intrepid adventure of ours, with my best friend at my side, even though I have to admit at this precise moment I would have done almost anything to be safely back at the cabin, enjoying an ice-cold glass of Coca-Cola with Nina. I knew the best course of action we could take was to be discreet when getting closer to the source of the strange music, as whoever was chanting wouldn't be remotely happy to be spied upon by two inquisitive teenage girls, so I indicated for Eloise to be as quiet as possible as we sashayed through the woods, rather like ballerinas on their points. In truth, we need not have worried about the noise we were making, for the crashing sounds of the stream made all other obtrusive noises none and void. The chanting persisted, getting louder and louder, and in my humble opinion, it sounded increasingly menacing and hostile, as if we were being warned to keep away. But I kept such troubling concerns to myself. We had long since forgotten about our promises to Nina that we would be gone for no more than 2 hours, for we had lost all track of time. The woods seemed to be getting increasingly darker by the second, but I thought that was due to the fact that we were walking in a heavily overgrown area where no light from the sun drifted through the trees. There was a still breeze brushing against our faces and nuzzling our skins rather affectionately, as if the woods were blowing kisses in our direction. Occasionally the darkness would subside, and a trickle of sunlight would happily shoot its way through the forest canopy, lighting up the leafy green tangle of ferns, ivy, and shade-loving plants that had been happy to make the forest floor their home. The deeper we ventured into the woods, the more physically disturbed I became. I couldn't shake off the hostile, malignant atmosphere of the woods that was becoming increasingly insufferable, as if some invisible force was expunging all the air from my lungs, as my breathing became quite erratic. It was so bad at one point that my anxiety was off the charts. I almost turned around and told Eloise straight to her face that we should go back at once, but Eloise appeared so intrigued about the chanting, as it ominously got louder and louder, with a discernible booming sound, and the music vibrated through our bodies. I knew I would feel like a pathetic wet blanket if I suggested we went back. But finally I couldn't hold my lingering reservations to myself any longer, so I told Eloise rather candidly. "I think we should go, Eloise," I told her. "It really feels off in here. I feel as if we shouldn't be here, as if we're intruding on someone's space. It sounds as even if the wind is telling us to go home. Listen to its moans. It really is saying, 'Go home.' Shouldn't we listen to it?" The hollow sounds of the wind that had picked up speed all of a sudden really did sound like it was telling us to go home. Even nature was warning us to exit the woods. Shouldn't we be paying attention to her nurturing voice, I thought. Eloise glared at me defiantly. "You really want to spoil things, do you, Blakely?" she snapped accusingly. "Come on, don't be a spoilsport." She grabbed me by the shoulder and somewhat violently thrust me ahead of the footpath. "We've come so far, Blakely. We're not giving up now. Aren't you even a teensy-weensy bit curious about the chanting sound? You're normally way more adventurous than me. What on earth is wrong with you? Am I the only one around here with any spunk?" At this point the chanting was so loud that me and Eloise sprang into action at once. Eloise indicated for me to quickly take cover, which we did behind the trunk of an enormous-sized tree, covered in golden leaves, with a girth so thick that we felt sure no one would see us. It was then that Eloise was pointing excitedly at something from beyond the tree. "Look!" Eloise whispered to me. "Over there! Can you see them, Blakely?" "I can't see anything," I replied. For a moment I couldn't see anything at all, rather just an indistinguishable vaporous hazy blur that was so incredibly dense I couldn't see anything through it at all, until the mist began to subside and thin out and become a lot more translucent. That was when I first observed the silhouettes, that were very vague, of dancing figures chanting along to the drum beats. In this ambiguous, foggy, vaporous curtain, They looked to be no more than black cardboard cutouts set against a white background. I squinted in the direction of my focus and steadied my gaze gingerly, while my heart drummed wildly in my chest, for what I was seeing put me on edge and stole away any calm, not that I think I had any in the first place. I was observing a circle of Indian warriors. They were dancing around a smouldering fire pit, but the flames of the fire pit appeared to be outer-worldly and very unnatural. Instead of being your usual orange or red colour, they appeared to be an icy blue colour, and the smoke that the fire pit gave off appeared to be lilac rather than grey. The Indian warriors were wearing eagle's feathers on their heads, white loincloths around their middles, colourful beads and bracelets. They possessed intimidating war-painted faces, obviously from the tribal makeup, and it looked menacing, almost as if their faces were purposely designed to intimidate. I could not stop staring at this strange little ceremony. It seemed to draw me right in, like iron filings to a magnet. The Indian warriors seemed locked up in a trance, almost as if they were drugged up to the nines. I didn't think they were aware of our presence, and that brought me a small measure of comfort, for I was terribly afraid of what they would do if they saw us or sensed us in any way, for these warrior men appeared rather formidable. I had a profound sense that we were watching a ceremony from another time, but it was being played back in our time-space, if you know what I mean. How I knew this, I am not entirely certain. Maybe it was because the figures I watched dancing around that unnatural fire would appear solid one moment and then almost become translucent the next, and that is not entirely natural. The music was so loud, it was banging violently in my ears and vibrating through my entire body, and I began to shake like a tree blowing in a wild, rather untethered windstorm. The Indian chief was wearing a huge Indian headdress made up of eagle's feathers. He was so severe-looking, I was almost afraid to look at him, lest I should faint on the spot. He stopped very suddenly, his head turned to look in our direction, and that was when I saw his eyes were completely white, and that scared the bejesus out of me, especially when they became a bright red colour and looked insidiously vile and malevolent. I knew he'd seen me, for his eyes seemed to sear through me like burning hot coals. I could see smoke coming out of his nostrils, and I had a profound sense that this Indian chief was enraged with us, for we had intruded upon his ceremony. I heard him cry out indignantly in his outrage, "Hargya! Home fun! Ollie!" His yells pierced right through my heart, like a very sharp spear. He shouted out something again, very loudly, in a raspy, deep voice, "Halipaki! Hatala!" and pointed in our direction. I heard a shuffle of feet and ear-piercing yells, "Yay!" As they began to chase after us, my heart began to race in my chest. I knew I was in mortal danger, and so I sprinted as fast as I possibly could. The voices screamed after us in a native language as they pursued us through the grove. There was no doubt these Indian warriors wanted our blood, and if they caught up with us, God forbid. I didn't even want to think about it, for I knew I would never see another day. I remember I was so dreadfully petrified that my bladder burst open, and urine trickled down my inner thighs, for both me and Eloise began to run like we have never ever run before or since, for our adrenaline turned up the heat of our endurance, like a race car on a track. I swear in that moment I felt my life flashing before my eyes, almost as if I sensed I was living on borrowed time. I rather suspect I felt like someone being chased by a savage lion or tiger, for that was how terrified I was. Eloise cried out, "They've got spears! Oh my God! They've got spears! They're going to kill us! They're going to kill us!" I glanced behind me and could see the angry mob descending upon us like a flock of geese, and then in a defeated mindset, I already found myself believing that my adrenaline-charged run would be completely futile, for we were no match for these angry, incensed warriors. They looked like once they caught up with us, they would thrust their spears into us hundreds of times, until fully satisfied that our lives had been finally expunged from our bodies. I was gasping for breath, my breathing fast and furious, my heart thundering in my chest as my knees wobbled precariously beneath me. I darted through the woods, grateful that I had some running experience behind me. All of a sudden, something grabbed me off the footpath. and lifted me up in the air. I let out a wild, ear-piercing shrill scream, and I wondered who was making that dreadful shriek, for it sounded like a squealing pig that was being butchered, and then I realized to my horror that I had been responsible for that unearthly scream. That was when I found myself not looking up into the face of an Indian warrior that was about to thrust a spear into my heart, as I'd expected. Instead, I found myself precariously snatched up into Bigfoot's arms like a child's toy. I looked over to see that another Bigfoot was holding Eloise up, and I was later to learn that that Bigfoot was in fact female. My fear had grown from bad to worse. Not only had we been chased by a bunch of Indians, but now we'd been snatched up by a couple of Bigfoots. Was this nightmare ever going to end for us, I wondered? How could a casual stroll in the woods go so badly wrong like this? I could hear Eloise sobbing. She cried out, "Please don't hurt us! Please don't hurt us! Please!" I was choking up so much, tears almost streaming in my eyes. Nothing came out of my mouth, for my tongue was tied. My fear had rendered me completely frozen. I was helpless. I stared up at the Bigfoot with horrified eyes, wondering if it was going to eat us. I knew the Bigfoot holding me up in his overlong arms was massive in size, stature, and girth. He could have easily been 10 foot tall. He was powerfully built, but his face was uncannily human, and that was his only reassuring feature. I was scared to look into his eyes, and tried desperately to avoid his gaze. I was absolutely certain that if I made eye contact with this Bigfoot, his intentions towards me would become very clear. And when you're ensnared in a hunter's trap, of which there seems no escape, it's best not to know the outcome, for it could be something that is far too traumatic for you to digest. All of a sudden I heard the high-pitched yells and shouts, and glanced over the Bigfoot's shoulders to see the Indians purging every tree and bush in the forest as they thrust their spears into everything they could, with an artful determination, as they began to search for us. Their spears were like sharp daggers that were eager to slay their wanton enemy, and there was no doubt they were looking for us. But why did they not see us? We were right there in close proximity to them, being held up by 2 large, great big Bigfoots, but they failed to observe us at all, which was seriously odd, I thought. All of a sudden I found myself looking into the Bigfoot's eyes, and when our eyes met I heard him speak to me in my head. "Don't worry, we're in a portal. They can't see you. You can see them, though, but they cannot see you. You're safe in here. It'll soon be over, and you can go back from whence you came. But it's not safe for you to remain here. You must leave at once, for they will come after you. You broke up their ceremony, and that for them is punishable by death." The Bigfoots propped us up in their arms for what seemed like an eternity, and it felt so surreal. Finally, the ghostly Indian warriors that I believe were from another time, who had been searching for us in vain, vanished from our sight, rather like a light being switched off from the mains in your bedroom. That was how fast it was. After that was over, both Bigfoots kindly escorted us back to the cabin, urging us to leave the place at once. I did not realize at the time my sister Nina was going through a drama all of her own. She had been sitting on her couch reading her book when she heard an urgent banging on the window pane of the cabin. She thought she had to be dreaming when she observed a Bigfoot staring in at her earnestly. This was obviously not one of the Bigfoots we had encountered. She wanted to scream, she was so afraid, but nothing came out of her mouth. That was when she heard the voice in her head, and she realized that this Bigfoot was communicating with her telepathically. "Get out of here! You're in danger! They're after you! And when they find you, they'll kill you!" With that, the Bigfoot had just vanished. My sister had rubbed her eyes, wondering if she was dreaming, until we ran into the cabin, crying out to her that we had to leave at once, for something terrible had happened. I was surprised that Nina didn't ask us any questions. She simply piled all our stuff into the back of the SUV. She didn't even say, "Why are you doing this?" or "What's wrong?" She never said anything for the entire 6-hour journey, which was incredibly strange, but none of us felt like talking. She then stopped her car 3 streets away from our home in Idaho, and then she turned around abruptly and asked us why we needed to leave the cabin in such a hurry. We told her everything that had happened to us in the woods, And then she told us about the Bigfoot that had looked in at her through the cabin window and told her to leave at once, for we were in mortal danger. All these years later, I believe that those Bigfoots saved us from a mob of Indian warrior ghosts, and for that I am sincerely grateful. I had a profound sense that our lives at the time were in perilous danger, for even the dead can hurt you if they're determined enough to do so. I'm glad to say that me and my best friend Eloise still remain the best of friends today. She was very lucky that she ended up living with her father. Ironically, Laura Ferguson married the man she met on the beach that wore the yellow Speedo costume, and from what I've gathered from Eloise over the years, that they're very happy together, although her mother remains obsessed over her appearance, as much as she was many years ago, and is still indulging herself in numerous surgical procedures to fight back the years and to enhance her appearance. I guess some things just don't ever change. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what an incredible story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.